Welcome to The Big Picture. I'm Phil Arno. If we're lucky, we can make it through our day. We wake up in the morning, we go through the day, and we get through to the end of the day, and nothing serious has happened. No great sorrow has come into our day. And we go along, we take care of the kids, we clean the house a little bit, maybe relax at the end of the day. But life isn't like that all the time. Sometimes life is pretty tough, and we lose people, we lose things that are close to us. And recently, all of Western New York and Southern Ontario experienced a loss. If you're old enough, it's almost like a family member has left us. Tom Joles passed away recently at the age of 89. I started my career at WKBW Radio and Channel 7 way back when Tom was still Commander Tom. And this show we're going to talk about Irv, Rick, and Tom. We're going to talk about the end of an era. And with me on this show is Linda Pellegrino, who is also a veteran of Channel 7 and a co-worker with Tom and all those great personalities. Mm-hmm. This is, in fact, the beginning of an end of an era that sadly is, I don't know whether it'll ever swing back in the other direction.
You know, Phil, I hope it does someday. They say, you know, when things go around, it comes around. But certainly, Irv, Rick, and Tom, you know, they stood out as a beacon in Western New York. They were all three very different personalities, different guys. But yet, when they came together, it was magic. You know, it was like the French Connection. There were three people who just got it. They understood, you know, the people who were watching them. And they related so well to them. And Tom was such a gentleman. He was lovely. I also started working with Tom when I started at Channel 7. I started on weekends, so I didn't see Tom much. Then they invented Live at 5. And so I was there then Monday through Friday. And I did the noon weather, the 5 o'clock weather, and then Tom was doing the 6 and 11 weather. So Tom indoctrinated me basically and taught me and mentored me about doing the weather. And understand that we weren't meteorologists then. We were personalities. You know, when you thought about it back then, they didn't have meteorologists all the time on the air. They wanted people who could fill in and do the weather at the end of 30 minutes. So sometimes, because the weather is at the end of the show, you got 2.5 minutes, or sometimes you got 4 minutes if a story didn't happen. So you had to ad-lib the forecast. So they wanted someone who could handle that time. And they were having a lot of success with radio people, which Tom was at one time. Clip Smith had come in and done the weather. A lot of people, Danny Neverett was doing the weather. So I was also from radio, had come in, was doing the weather on weekends and started on Monday through Friday. And Tom was the best. He was so generous with his time. And, you know, he always had a smile on his face, always had time to show you the latest thing of what we were learning now for the computers. At the time, all we had as a map was a small map outdoors, and you would put your arm in. Bob Kaczynski used to call it the snake, when you move your arm. And then we graduated to a great big screen behind us where you could see, you'd be full figured, and they could see you from head to toe. So we were learning all these little gadgets and all this science, this technology on the fly. And Tom was just such a wonderful person to teach you. And he had such a gentle way about him that you knew his gift was, yes, he could explain the weather to the audience, but he was the audience. He was you and I out there.
That's part of it.
Mm-hmm.
Back then, and this is the great difference between then and now, there was personality.
Yes.
Each one of them, Irv, Rick, and Tom, they were all different.
Right.
All very
different.
But it was a cross-section of Western New York, and everybody had something that they could identify with. Mm-hmm. And Tom was the gentleman.
Yes.
He was the gentleman. And off camera, he was the same as he was on camera.
Right.
But to everybody's surprise, anybody who knew Tom, he was a very shy man. Mm-hmm. And he always amazed me because he seemed to be surprised at what's the fuss?
Exactly.
I'm just a normal guy,
Very
but
humble.
people, yeah, very, very humble. Unlike Irv and Rick they were both very outgoing and joked a lot and really were loud, and it was quite the contrast.
Yes.
But that's what made it local, because they were us.
Yes.
They were part of Western New York and Southern Ontario.
Phil, when you start in radio, you're an anonymous person. You can be very, very popular, but when you leave the radio station and you walk outside, nobody knows who you are because they don't recognize you because your face isn't on. In television, all of a sudden, you're a famous person because you're being seen. And Tom understood that because, again, started from radio. I started from radio. Just because you were in radio didn't mean you weren't as talented as someone in TV. So when you got to television and you got that instant fame or celebrity, Tom lived the fact that you can be a very good person and a very nice person and be a person who everybody knows. You can still be nice. You don't have to be an idiot. You don't have to be nasty to people because you're recognized. And you can walk that path. And that's probably one of the biggest lessons that I learned. You be the person that people think you are. You be that good person. And what a legacy, to leave the rest of us.
And one of the differences in presentation for news back then and weather was because, and you kind of put your finger on it, because they weren't experts like meteorologists, and they were basically the average person who was presenting the information.
Right.
They had to understand what they were talking about.
Yes.
And they had to know how to explain it to people out there who had to understand what they were talking about. So
true.
it came across in a very logical way, and it was information. Today, not so much, because today the reporters really don't understand to a great extent what they're talking about. They have an assignment, and here's what you say. And so they go out and they do a story, and it's slanted to get a result. And this is what they tell the people. That wasn't what it was back then.
No, it's not the way it's supposed to be.
No, that's not journalism.
Right.
Journalism is you're supposed to explain what's going on, and then the people there, they can judge for themselves.
Exactly. They should never know how you feel about something politically.
Right.
People should never know if you're the broadcaster. They should never know how you feel about something. It's not about you. It's about the story, and it's about just getting the facts out. You let the people make the decision about the facts. And I used to try to explain that to some of the new reporters coming in. If they had to report on something they didn't agree with. And I'm like, wait a minute, let's stop the meeting. It's not about you. Right. It's about the facts of the story. You have to learn that as a reporter.
That's an evolution that I really don't appreciate about journalism, and that is, it's no longer objective.
Right.
That has gone out the window, and I experienced that in Los Angeles a lot.
And getting back to Tom was always, when we had a storm, some kind of a system coming into Buffalo, Tom would explain it to reassure people. Yeah, we're going to get maybe 6 inches of snow, but we can handle it. We're Western. Right. He would go the other way and play it down. So he would give you faith that, okay, this is Western New York. Yeah, it's going to be nasty for a couple of days. Nothing we haven't had before. Now it's just the opposite. Right. It's like, let's lead with snow, and everybody's like, what's the panic about? I mean, if it's just, it's typical Western New York weather. And that was another thing, back in the day, they looked at things on how the audience would perceive this and how to help instead of how to, go on the offensive, so to speak. Isn't that something?
It's basically, it's one of those things where, you are now not trying to excite, back then. Right. You weren't trying to, get the reaction. You were just trying to get people to know what was going on. Yes. Today, it's a different thing. How can we get people excited and get their emotions up and get them all in a tizzy so that they'll come back and listen for more later on?
Different day, different age, right?
Yeah. And the business has changed. It's changed quite a bit. Tell me, speaking of the business, now you are on radio now.
Yes, I'm back on radio now.
Tell me a little bit about what you're doing.
Oh, I love it. Before I retired from AM Buffalo, I had an opportunity to go back to radio. In fact, go back to WBEN where I started in 1979 to 1980, I started on WBEN when they were on Elmwood Avenue. And radio was really where I was trained. If it wasn't for radio, I couldn't have done AM Buffalo because I couldn't have ad-libbed. Radio is where you develop your personality. And I loved it, loved it. Then from WBEN, I went to WKBW. That was incredible. And then from there, I went over to television. So after all this big career in television, I had an opportunity to go back and do a show called Senior Radio Buffalo, which is perfect because that's where I am in life now. Joe Chili was going to retire from it, and he was moving on to other things. And I had the opportunity to move in as host. And I love it. We went from 1 hour on Saturday at 11 o'clock to now 2 hours because the audience wants it. There's a lot of information for people like you and I, 50 plus, 60 plus, that's just not available. But we need to know it because there's not a lot in the media that serves 55 plus. And it's a shame because we're at our smartest, we're at our wealthiest. We have so much to give back because we have time, and we're minimized.
And that's not recognized
No.
really in so many aspects of this business. That's not recognized. We're out of time in this segment. When we come back, we're going to get into that a little bit about how the industry has evolved and kind of turned their back on what's relevant, actually. We'll get into that as soon as we come back. Stay tuned.
And I want to thank, lastly, all of you, the viewers, both in the United States and in Canada. I feel as though I'm the luckiest person in the world who have heard from so many of you with cards and letters and email and gifts. Thank you for those words of encouragement, for the words that say, have a great retirement, because that's what I intend to do, is have a great retirement. So I say to you, may God bless you, and may all your days be salubrious. So long, everybody.
Welcome back to The Big Picture. And we're talking about Tom Joles and Irv, Rick, and Tom. And my guest is Linda Pellegrino and Senior Radio Buffalo. And we're talking about a little bit about the media today versus back then. And one of the things that is very different, when Irv, Rick, and Tom were at their height, there was no internet. Computers didn't really exist. You got your information from 3 television stations in the market.
Yes.
And that's really how people found out about what was going on around them. And that was the local information, okay? Things have evolved, and the TV stations are now owned by big corporations that own 200 stations and 200 markets, and they can't be local in 200 different places because they would bankrupt the big corporations. So local for television stations has gone away, except for WBBZ.
That's right.
I want to put that out there.
Thank goodness.
So you don't get local other than maybe a news program, but as we've talked about, the presentation has changed.
Yes.
So there's not a lot of relevance in the way you get your local information. And when you get on the internet, you get on your computer and you do searches, it's very sporadic or chaotic, and you can't really count on local information. Going back to radio and what you're doing now, it's kind of a throwback to what was. You can get information about what's going on locally. And we talked about, just before the break, the older generation, I don't want to say older, but our generation.
The master generation. That's what I like to call it.
We're not struggling to pay the rent,
Right.
okay? We're still active, and we're still doing a lot of things, and yet, as advertisers and agencies that cater to, that spend money on advertising, we don't seem to be the desirable people.
No.
And that's kind of an oxymoron. It's really a puzzling thing, because we have the disposable income.
Yes, we do.
And you would think that they would want to appeal to the people who can spend the money.
You know, we're still such a young country, and our just, you know, our populations and the US, we're only 200 years old. Over in Japan, they revere older people, much, much older civilization. And I think we've yet to learn that there's so much to be learned from those who came before us. And just like history, to not look at history is to, you're liable to repeat it. We're learning that we really should not be as discounted as we are. We've got a lot to offer. And I'm finding now through senior radio that there's information out there, but it's hard to get for you and me. What should we really know about Social Security? What should we really know about Medicare? What about hanging on to our money and establishing our estates and things like that? Who's out there to help us? That's what our show does. It addresses all of that. And we're finding that we have this really incredible audience that is not how it is portrayed on television. Every time I see a commercial that portrays older people, my blood boils. It's Martha, who's like, in her 90s, who's difficult, and that's not us. I'm 67, going on 68. I don't see myself as that Martha. And I think there's an awful lot of, there's almost like two generations in what we call seniors. There's 50 plus, and then there's 80 plus, so it's me, my sister, and my mother, you know what I mean, who's like another generation. So we have these incredible Americans who have been through World War II, Vietnam War, Korea, who are still vibrant, who are still out there helping, who have something to impart to other people. And the media is just obsessed with youth. If you're not, 25 or you're not 18, for some reason they discount you. And it's a big mistake because we've got a lot to say. We're a big voting bloc. And I think only when we open our mouths and we go to the polls and we make ourselves heard will that change.
Yeah, it's hard to understand why the conception is what it is. When I was in Hollywood many years ago, I wrote a script that took place 50 years into the future, and I had to do research. Part of the research was what was the average life expectancy 50 years in the past. And at the time, the average life expectancies back in the World War II era were like, if you were a male in the 1940s or 50s, your average life expectancy was 55 or 60 years old.
Yes, you were considered old.
Yeah,
right?
and that was back then. So, and then moving forward, going into the future, the average life expectancy is going to approach 100.
Yes.
Okay, so the perception is back there in the 1940s. If you're 50 or 60 years old, or even 70 years old, you're ancient.
Yes.
Okay, whereas the reality is now if you're 100 years old, now you're getting up there.
Right. You've had a good life.
Your expiration date is
if
there.
If you're 100, you're lucky.
Yes.
Yeah, it's incredible.
Tom Joles, he just passed at the age of 89.
Yep.
And more people are living into their 90s. I know several people who are quite healthy and they're in their 90s.
Yes.
That wasn't the case when I was young.
No.
So
no.
The perception has changed more slowly than the reality.
And I think we who are aging now have to think about it like, and I say this on the radio show all the time, what's the point of living to 100 if you don't feel well? Work on making sure you're living into your 80s, but you're feeling well. Are you going to the doctor? Are you getting that knee replaced? Are you making plans in the future? Because when you make plans in the future, you tend to be excited and live into the future. So we all also have to change our heads about that because we are healthier and we need to respect who we are and now say, okay, what do I want to do with my life now? Not say it's over or this is all behind me. Maybe the best is yet to come.
So on Senior Radio Buffalo, what typically do you talk about for a couple of hours?
We do, we're under a big umbrella. We have a part of the show that we maintain the nuts and bolts of getting older. Our doctors, our lawyers, our people who are out here to help us make sure we get what we need and what is out there. A lot of people turn 65 and they don't know anything about Medicare. I thought Medicare was free when you turn 65. What a change I walked into. A lot of people don't want to face it until they get to that age. So we do that. And we also have another part of the show that we call Aging Gracefully. And we'll talk to my friend Phil, who's a hairdresser. We talk to mental health experts. We talk to people about our bodies changing. Maybe it's love. Maybe it's finding, something that's entirely different for you at a certain age. And it's all okay. It's okay. Maybe, I'll tell you, Phil, we're talking to a lot of men now, and we're touching on mental health. And a lot of people have not dealt with their mental health. And it's okay to see a mental health counselor. If you're a man in your 60s, it wasn't a macho thing to do, but it might be okay, and it might change the future that you might still have 40 years on this earth. So we're touching all those things.
It's interesting. The evolution of society has seemed to gone in a direction where there's a certain lack of common sense these days. And I cover that a lot on this show. There's a lot of things that are happening in society today that just don't seem to make sense, especially when you've lived through what we've lived through, and the gender identities and the things that are happening with kids and explaining things to third graders and so on. I don't know whether, I'm sure every generation looks back at the upcoming generation and says that doesn't make sense. But I don't know whether this is an exception to the rule or whether things have changed. It's just, there are certain things that I see that, my father, my grandfather, they'd be rolling over in their graves right now.
Very true. Phil, I think that everything has its season. And I think for many, many years, it was a very conservative country. And if the needle was here, it'd be like up and down. We have taken it in these last few years and now have gone, where we're pinning the needle over here. It's so liberal. And I think eventually that's not going to be able to sustain itself, and it'll come back. You know what I mean? Just like, every 4 years or every 8 years, you have a Democrat, then you have a Republican, and then they straighten things out, then you have a Democrat. I don't really think the world has changed in humanity's time. I just think that our opportunity to see every single story out there has now changed. I think it's just a matter of, we get so much input. We can find out what's going on in Thailand in 10 minutes, where you would never get that 100 years ago. And I think it's just an overload of information, and people feel like they must act on it, Well,
we've got about 2 minutes left in the show. I think I want to get back to the difference now between what Irv, Rick, and Tom used to do, and the presentation and the journalism, and what's going on today. I don't think that journalism today serves the country, either locally or nationally, for that matter, the way it used to.
I agree.
I think journalism today has a mission to channel people's opinions in a direction, and it almost is a throwback to
totalitarianism, right? That's a tough one.
It's a tough, but the government's trying to control opinions, and they're doing it through media, and that's never a good thing.
No.
Back in the day, it was, here's information, you make a decision as for what's good and what's bad.
Correct.
Now it's like, here's what's good and what's bad. We will tell you how to think.
And we will persecute you.
And if you don't go along with it, the people who do go along with it will be the loudest people, and they will persecute you for not stepping in line.
Right.
And that's dangerous. That is very, very dangerous. That's the stuff of 1984.
It's so true.
Think the thought police. And when you can condemn somebody for what they're thinking instead of what they're doing, that, my friends, is a very dark road to go down.
Not a world we really will thrive in. No, not at all.
No, and be very, very careful how you treat somebody because of the way they think, because that can turn around on you very quickly.
We started this conversation with Tom Joles. Tom was an honest person, and he was a kind person. If we could all be honest and kind, what a world we'd be living in.
Well, it comes down to empathy. You have to have empathy for what everybody has in their
basket, right?
In their Everybody's had, you know,
Mhm.
their childhood and their upbringing and their family. We all have that in common.
Mhm.
You know, some people have a harder time than other people, but we all have that common experience.
Mhm.
Moms and dads and religion, and there's this humanity that we can identify with.
Yes.
And when you're ready to lose your temper with someone, think about how their loved ones would look at you for hollering at their little boy or their little girl,
Right.
and how you would hurt their feelings. And maybe that puts a little personal spin on it. And maybe you would say, okay, well, let me step back, because if this was my daughter or my brother or my sister, I wouldn't want somebody to holler at them the way I'm about to holler at this guy.
And you know, Phil, now that I'm getting older, I find myself more in that camp. I have more patience because I can step back and say, what's going through that person's head today?
Yeah.
Are they having issues? Instead of,
Right.
you know?
Right. I found that on the road.
Yes.
When it's so impersonal, because it's a car, not
Right.
a person that just cut me off.
Exactly.
And now I try and figure, wait a
Right.
second, there's a person in there who might be having a bad day.
Exactly.
Let's cut them some slack and just
Give
mind
'em a
my own
pass.
business.
Right.
Give them a pass.
Give 'em a pass.
All right. Now, speaking of a pass, that's it for this show, folks. Let's pass on this show, and hopefully you enjoyed it. Hopefully you'll come back and watch the next Big Picture, which will be next Monday night at 8. I appreciate you watching the Big Picture. We appreciate you watching WBBZ-TV, because, as we've said, this is local. We're your local TV station. We want to be part of Western New York. We want to be your station. We appreciate you watching, and we will see you next time on The Big Picture. Thanks again.